All right, thank you very much. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks for joining, everyone. If you don't know where you are, this is the OpenColorIO Town Hall for 2023, and thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to be flying through lots of different stuff, but this is just sort of the run of show today. I'm going to do a little bit of an intro to OCIO and some things that we want to talk about before we jump into project update. We'll talk a little bit about the OCIO supported configs. We have an exciting demo of a new OCIO app called OcioView. And then we're going to end with some updates on the Unreal Engine integration, followed by, as long as we all stick to our timetables, some Q&A at the end. So, like I said, I'm Carol Payne. I am the Technical Steering Committee Chair for OpenColorIO, and I'm joined by a couple other folks that'll be presenting throughout the day, but one of them is Doug Walker, who's on the call. He's our Chief Architect for OpenColorIO. And then we're also joined by Rémi Achard, who is a Technical Steering Committee member, and Michael Dolan, who is a Technical Steering Committee member. And then we're also joined by Éric Renaud, who is been developing for Epic Games and Unreal Engine for OCIO. I want to start by doing a big shout out to all of our technical steering committee members. We have a couple others on the call as well, I believe. They put a ton of work into making OCIO a reality throughout all of the times when we're not talking about it. And I want to in particular welcome two new technical steering committee members since this last year, Zach Lewis from Method Studios and Thomas Manson-Cal from Weta Effects. So a look over the last year, we wanted to put this in a little bit of a timeline view for everybody, because we're settling into a decent sort of rhythm with how often and sort of what we release as far as the OCIO library and the configs go. And you can see that, starting back from last year, when first thing that's on there is our config release, because that needed to predate the version 2.2 release that was in October. You'll notice that this year our version 2.3 release is targeted for the end of August instead, and that's probably going to be the timing going forward. We're trying to comply very on time with the VFX reference platform guidelines and timelines, so that all of the apps that depend on that structure can get OpenColorIO and the other associated libraries implemented in next year's versions of software without much hassle. So we'll release version 2.3 at the end of August, and that will also be predated by a configs release, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. And then we also always do a couple point releases in between. Specifically, when we do a library release, we know that there's always going to be some things that we need to fix, some bugs to catch. And so we'll do an ABI compatible features and fixes release targeted for the beginning of next year. And that will be the version that we anticipate will go into most softwares for the VFX reference platform next year. We have a couple new integrations, brand new integrations of OCIO to celebrate. We love when we see OCIO in software that it wasn't incorporated into before. The three that we want to talk about today are 3ds Max. We want to talk about After Effects. We know that there's been an amazing plugin supported by Nordware that enables OCIO use in After Effects and Photoshop for many years. But last year, After Effects implemented OpenColorIO version 2 natively, and we're really, really excited about that. And then Anchor Point also is a new implementation of OpenColorIO in its software. And speaking of version 2, I want to take a moment to point out that there's a ton of software actually that I know version 2 for OCIO still seems new and fancy, and it sort of feels sometimes like everybody is still struggling to move to it, and that's true, but we're really happy with the number of applications that have adopted OpenColorIO v2 and above in their apps. This is just a snapshot of them pulled from what we have listed on our website and supported applications. We know that there's more out there that support OpenColorIO version 2. If that's you and you don't see your logo here, contact us or put in a PR to our website. We list all of our supported apps on the website, and we'd love to have as many of these featured as possible. The last thing I'll say, we'll do this slide here and we'll do this slide at the end. OCI only functions from the help, work, and feedback from our community, and we have lots of different ways that you can get involved with the project. I will say that our Slack, which is separate still from the Academy Software Foundation's main Slack, I put the link here. Our Slack predates the ASWF Slack, and we get a lot of questions of, are we ever going to move over to the ASWF Slacks? And the answer to that is maybe, but not right now. And so for now, our Slack instance is still separate, and it is the main method of communication for the project these days. Most of our questions and answers and information and meeting notes all get posted there. We do have mailing lists if you prefer that. And sometimes we'll send out big notices, like you saw for some SIGGRAPH things went out through our mailing lists. They don't get as much traffic as they used to, though. And then some other important links there, our main website, which has everything that's listed on this slide if you don't have time to copy it down. And then we do have several meetings throughout the month. The technical steering committee meeting is when we do our main project maintenance. It's open to anybody. So our technical steering committee attends those meetings, and they are the ones that maintain the project. But anybody can come and talk about issues that they're having or features they'd like to see, or just come to listen in and participate. We've also got 2 working group meetings. Config, we'll talk about the configs working group later. And then the UX working group, which is every 4th Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific, and that has a Slack channel as well, the UX channel. And that one's been going for a bit, and we'll be probably picking that work back up post SIGGRAPH once we have a little bit of room to breathe. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Walker and Rémi Achard.
Thanks, Carol. So I'm Doug Walker. I work for Autodesk as the technology lead for color science, and I'm also serving as the chief architect on the OCIO Technical Steering Committee. And I'd like to review the features that we've been working on over the past year. Next slide, please. So the first 2, OcioView and the new ACES configs, will be covered later in the presentation. So I'm going to skip right to the config merging feature, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rémi to cover the other features. So for config merging, we have a couple of use cases in mind. This is a commonly requested feature, and one of the examples is for studios that have a main config that they have for the facility, but then they have an additional few color spaces that they may want to add on a per show basis. That's kind of the first use case we're thinking of. Another one is some applications have a need to add certain color spaces. So for example, a camera log color space, or like sRGB or Scene Linear Rec 709. And they're able to do this today using the API, but it's a little bit opaque to config authors. And the config merging feature would allow applications to publish their merge config. And that way config authors can know exactly what color spaces an application would need to add. And the third use case is a request that we get a lot on our Slack, for example, where users may have a LUT that they want to add to an existing config, for example, like the ACES configs. And the config merging feature would make this a lot simpler for less experienced users to be able to do that. At the bottom of the screen, I've put a link to the wiki where we have more detail on the use cases and other aspects of the merge feature. Next slide, please. So I list here some of the various merge strategies that will be supported. So, for example, to merge the content from config A and config B, with A having precedence, meaning that if both configs have an item with the same name, the one from config A would be used. And the idea is that we would provide separate control over each section of the config. So if you have, like if you wanted to add some new color spaces, but you don't want to change anything in the displays views section or other sections of the config, it's possible to do that. Next slide. One of the more powerful aspects of this feature is the OcioM file format. And this is a YAML file that contains the references to the configs to be merged and any of the merge options. And the idea is that this could be used anywhere where a config.ocio file could be used today. So for example, if an application is using the create from file command to load a config, if that's a path to an OcioM file, it would be transparent to the application. The Ocio library would load the OcioM file, merge the configs, and pass the merged config back to the application. So it's essentially transparent to the application. Next slide, please. So a few other aspects of this that are worth noting. There'll be an option to avoid adding duplicate color spaces. So in other words, if one of the configs is trying to add a color space to another config and it already has an identical color space, that color space won't be added. In addition, it will be possible for the merge to work even if the two configs use different reference color spaces, and that will be based on the functionality that was added last year in OCio 2.2. And another option is it will be possible to have any of the new color spaces that get added to a config appear in their own menu hierarchy. A few other items to note. So there'll be a flag in the YAML that config authors will be able to use to request to opt out of any merging on their config. And the other thing to note is that the implementation is being done in the app helpers section of the code. So it doesn't require changes to the sort of core classes like the config or the parser. So this we feel will help the lower the risk of the feature, basically. Next slide. So this is there's a lot of workflow implications to config merging, especially the OcioM file format. And there's a lot of active discussion still happening in the TSC. So we decided that we won't include this in the 2.3 release itself. What we're planning to do is include this in a separate branch alongside the 2.3 release that we'll be calling a tech preview. So this will give the community time to try it out and give us some feedback before we commit to it as an officially supported feature. So please don't use this in production yet, but we'd love to have your feedback. Next slide, please. So with that, I will turn it over to Rémi Achard from DNEG, who's another OCIO TSC member, and he'll review the other new features that we're adding in 2.3.
Thanks, Doug. So yeah, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you some of the other feature plan for 2.3, starting with the Apple Silicon processor support improvement. So first, we now support officially the universal build. So this is a way to ship a single binary on both the M1 and M2 and the Intel architecture on Mac. So that's now officially supported. We also have some improvement regarding the vector extension. So as you may know, SSE is not working on ARM. So that's the M1, for example. So we added a new translation layer using the library called SSC to Neon. That's able to dynamically translate the SSC to Neon, which allow us to have like some good performance improvement, as you can see in the first highlighted row. Compared to the native C++ ARM build, we have 50% improvement. And compared to the Rosetta translation happening on Mac on Mac ARM when you use the x86 executable, we also get around 20% improvement. Next slide, please. So we also have some further CPU vector optimization for Intel and AMD architecture. So this is using the AVX intrinsic. This is implemented for the 1D and the 3D LUT evaluation. In some case, as you can see in the benchmark below, we can have over 2x improvement. I should say that this is targeting multiple versions of SSC and IVX, and it will be dynamically dispatched depending on your runtime processor. So depending on the processor you use, OcioView will be able to use the most efficient vector extension. This is a work we plan to have for 2.3, but maybe not for 2.3.0. It will be probably in a patch release along the way. So thanks to Mark Reid for that work. Next slide, please. So some update to the Python package. So we are going to include now the command line application in the Python wheel. So this is a feature that's been requested and now will allow you to use directly all the C++ application you are maybe familiar with. So like OcioView Backlit, OcioView Display and such, directly from a pip install. You will also have access to some Python application like PyOcioView AMF, PyOcioView Display, and OcioView that you will see later. We had to make some updates to the Python package, like switching from static to dynamic linking to keep the size of the package in check. And we also removed some test data that was still in the package. So all that to improve or reduce the size of the package. And I'd like to thank Jean-Christophe Morin for providing valuable feedback on that work. Next slide, please. Finally, we also made some update to our build process and CI. So for the CMake build process, we now will support a minimum and recommended version for the dependencies. So this is a way to provide basically the minimum version that will be what OcioView asks you provide if you want to use the dependency on your system. And the recommended version is going to be used if you ask OcioView to build itself the dependency. And we also have some update to our CI process. So we added some new CI workflow, including a thing we call platform latest that's going to use the latest compiler and OS available on GitHub Action, as well as doing some memory testing using the address sanitizer from your compiler. And we also added VFX 2023 reference platform test and removed the VFX 2019. So what it means is Python 2 is no longer tested and officially supported. That's it for the new feature in 2.3 I'm going to cover. So I'm going to give it back to Doug Walker for the roadmap. Thanks.
Thanks, Rémi. And thank you as well to JF Panasay for the Docker containers for the VFX reference support and the CI working group. We really appreciate their work. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the year ahead and what we're planning. Roadmap planning is always challenging for open source projects, but we know it's important to applications who are planning on integrating future versions. And so we want to give you some some guidance about what we're thinking of and get your feedback on what you think is most important. So two of the trends that seem very important are the increasing prevalence of web and mobile platforms. And so in that regard, having a lighter weight version of the library would help, along with a JavaScript binding. And we also find that there are more and more cases where applications are running on the GPU and would like kind of pure shader-based color transforms without LUTs, because allocating textures to evaluate lookup tables on the GPU is costly on lower-end hardware. And it's important to keep in mind that since OcioV2 came out, Ocio is now able to do more without needing LUTs. So for example, with the new ACES configs, those are entirely implemented as shaders. There's no LUTs needed for that. So really a lot of Ocio processing can be done this way. So we think we should be able to support the needs of applications that want to do pure shader-based color management quite effectively. Next slide, please. So one of the ideas we have for next year is to do an OCIO version targeted for the web. So this would be a smaller version of the library with fewer dependencies, primarily aimed at GPU processing via shaders that would have a JavaScript binding, and that would have some restrictions compared to the full library. So for example, no file transform or LUT support. So that's one of the things that we're thinking about. We'd like to get your feedback on that. And there's a few other things that we have in mind as well. Next slide, please. So of course, the ACES project is working on new output transforms. So as soon as those are released, that's obviously going to be a top priority to get that into OpenColorIO as well. And I have a list here of some of the other things that the TSC has been talking about. Common LUT format is undergoing SMPTE standardization right now. So when the new version of that is available, we want to support that. Vulkan and a number of other things that are on our radar. And so these are all things that we'd be interested in hearing your feedback about. And we'd also like to know, what are the most important things from your point of view. And with that, I will turn it back to Carol to talk about the updates to the OCIO configs for ACES.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks, Rémi. So you get to hear me talk again because our fearless leader of the config development, who's been doing the vast majority of the work on all of the new configs for OCIO v2 and also supported them long before the ACES configs for version 1, long before they lived officially in the OCIO repository, Thomas Manson-Cal. It is the middle of the night for him. So want to take a moment firstly to do a big thank you to him for all of the work that he has been doing and continues to do for the OCIO config work and development. We wouldn't be able to do this without all of his time and experience in this area. So a little bit of a reminder, the ACES-based configs for OCIO v2, we released them last year, and we're prepping to release version 2 of them with OCIO 2.3. There are 3 of them: the ACES reference config, the CG config, and the studio config. The reference config is just what it says, development, testing, and a reference version. It's not intended for production use. The CG config is self-contained, so it doesn't have any external file dependencies. Like Doug mentioned before, it takes advantage of the built-ins in the OCIO library. And it's a subset of what you might be used to seeing in the old ACES configs. It doesn't have the camera IDTs or all of the many options for output transforms. We really tried with this config to slim it down, and purpose build it for fully computer generated workflows for animation and graphics and game engines and whatever else real-time work that you might be doing, so that you have a lightweight version of a config with no external file dependencies. And that also about this config is built into the OCIO library. So you don't even actually have to call an external OCIO file to use it if you're using the OCIO API. The last one is the ACES Studio config. This one is the closest replacement for what you might be used to seeing in the previous ACES version 1 configs. But it makes use of all the version 2 features, so it really doesn't look very similar, but it has everything, most everything you'd come to expect. But we did do a substantial amount of work in this config as well to slim it down and only include latest versions of things, the most relevant things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. This config is also built into the OCIO library directly. We're continuing to do a lot of work on these configs. We have been meeting up to this point bi-weekly, but we're going to move to meeting monthly for these configs and try and put all the updates into a monthly meeting instead. We meet on Tuesdays at 1 Pacific, and we also have a configs Slack channel. So please join and give us feedback on these configs. Are you using them? What's working? What would you like to see? Because we take that feedback into account, and it is the reason for a lot of the things that went into our version 2 release or going to be in our version 2 release this year. One of the big ones is we're adding display P3 color spaces, both as a color space in linear and sRGB encodings, and then also as a display color space. This is via a new PR that got merged into ACES Dev to add a CTL companion implementation of display P3. So thanks again to Thomas for getting that into ACES Dev, because our OCIO config implementation is based off of ACES Dev for all of the ACES-based transforms. We also added a texture category, the ability to tag color spaces as textures, similar to what you would do other categories such as file IO. We also added 2 new input transforms, Canon Log 2 and Sony's S Log 2. We added Canon Log 2 at the request of Canon, and happily Canon Log 2 and Canon Log, we had Canon Log 3 previously, but Canon Log 3, based on feedback from Canon, was not meant to supersede Canon Log 2. They're meant to be used independently for different reasons. So we have added Canon Log 2 and its curve and linear space and all of those things to the new version of the configs. S-Log2 we've added based on user feedback. A couple productions and workflows and cameras are still using S-Log2, even though S-Log3 is the newer color space from Sony, input color space from Sony. So we've added that based on user feedback. We've also done a couple bug fixes, you might call them, fixing some issues with the inactive color spaces that we caught on these configs. And then another one that a lot of people have been calling a bug. Oh, it's been in the configs for so long, I don't know that I would, it's a fix, it's a change. We have finally made the change to swap the matte paint and texture paint role assignments. I know that's been a long asked for change. And we finally feel comfortable making that change with version 2 of these configs. We feel that now that they have a version of the configs version 1 to use with OCIO 2, we can make this switch, and then applications can make the switch to these new versions of the configs when they're ready in their software and not disrupt pipelines, because we know that the changing of a role, while it might seem small, can be incredibly disruptive in pipelines for both software and just visual effects pipelines in general. And then lastly, I want to talk just a little bit. We don't have a ton of time to go over this, so know that we'd love to talk about this a little bit more in our BOF next week if you're going to be able to join us in person, and then throughout the rest of this year in the configs working group, a little bit about our methodology and how we think about these configs and why we support what we do and don't. And the first thing I'll talk about is how we name them and version them. And this is what we do right now. It's not set in stone necessarily, but this is how we're thinking about it. So this name is what will be the name of the new released configs later this month. The first number is the config version itself. So what this is the second major release of these OcioIO v2 configs. The next number is the ACES library version that it's using. So in this case, it's 1.3, which is the latest ACES tagged release. And the last number here is the OcioIO library version that this config is meant to use. And that's 2.3 for this upcoming release, and that's what's going to be built into the new OcioIO 2.3 library releases. You can generate configs for earlier OcioIO versions, should you want to, and use them in applications that don't have latest and greatest support yet, and that would be then indicated in that version tag for the OcioIO library at the end. You just might not be able to use all of the latest and greatest features that say are called in the config but are only available in the later versions of the library. So just keep that in mind, that you'll have to, make do with some different things as we add things throughout the life cycle of the library that affect the ability to call those in the configs via built-ins or whatever that might be. And then the last thing that we'll talk about is that these configs are ACES based and represented, but they're not bound and they're not meant to be at this point in time, really, or ever, because that's just not how studio workflows work, a one-to-one representation of ACES dev or vice versa. We've gotten a lot of questions over the last few years of like, this doesn't exist in the OcioIO config, but it exists in ACES, or this exists in ACES, but it doesn't exist in the OcioIO config. And that is, I want to say most of the time we make mistakes, as always, and obviously please give us feedback, but on purpose. We have made some exclusions on purpose from the studio config based on feedback from the community and what we have seen used in the studios represented in our TSC. Certain output transforms, such as the DCDM output transforms, which we don't think anybody are using, we don't include those by default in the studio config. We also have tried to do our best to lessen the amount of information and color spaces in these configs. And so we are trying to only include the latest and greatest of the transforms for camera inputs. So we have eliminated S-Log1 and things like red log film that have been superseded by newer versions from the camera manufacturers. And we're doing that one, to keep the configs clean and as light as we can, and two, to reduce user confusion around what's the best choice or what's the correct choice. And we feel that in most cases, we're trying to keep to what's currently in use on productions. And so this will change and adapt over time, and we won't always include everything. And sometimes we may drop stuff. And then a couple other things that they're just on not in use in everyday productions. If you're missing something, the likelihood of it being able to generate a config with that in it is high. And then also give us that feedback. If it's commonly used, we want to hear it, and we would consider adding it into a future release. With that said, we also have some non-ACES based things in the config, things like the sRGB texture spaces and utility linear spaces those are not ACES transforms. They are just standard color space, standard transforms. And so those will always be in the configs for a visual effects and animation workflow use. Like I said, this is only kind of an intro to the way we're thinking about these configs, and we'd love to talk to the community more about them at the BOF. But that's all the time that I have to talk about it today. So I'm going to hand it over to Michael to talk about OcioView.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, I'm Michael Dolan, work at Epic Games, and I'm on the technical steering committee. So you can go to the next slide. So OcioView is a new app that has been in the works for quite a while. It's kind of just been a side project of mine, but it's come to a point now where I'm contributing it back to OpenColorIO and inviting participation from others in the community to help improve it. But in essence, it's a visual editor for OpenColorIO configs. It's written in Python. And this slide outlines some of the key features of it, but I recorded a video demo to kind of help Timebox being able to show you this, but not take too much time because I could talk about it for a really long time. So if we jump to the next slide, I'll go ahead and show that demo, which will give you an idea of the capabilities of the application and some use cases. And I'll go ahead and share that now. On the left side here, we have our image viewer, and on the right side, we have the config editor. First, I'm going to show you the config editor. Each of these tabs represents a different config item type that we can edit. This first tab is the config properties. On the next tab, you can see that we have all of the color space roles defined in the config. Now let's go down to the rules portion of the config editor. Here you can define file rules as well as viewing rules. Here we have the display and view section. On the top we have a table of displays, and then for each display we have a table of its views. If we toggle down through the displays, you'll see the view menu below updates to show you all of the views for that display. Here's the list of color spaces that are defined in this config. Let's go to a color space that has some transforms defined for it. So we're going to look at the sRGB texture space. You'll notice when you click on these, all the interface updates for that item. Now, one of the common elements between looks, view transforms, color spaces, and named transforms is that you have 3 tabs for editing each item. You have a tab for manipulating the properties of the item, and then you have 2 transform stack tabs. Each transform stack is a vertical layer stack where each layer is a transform. The order is important, and that's why each transform has an arrow through which you can reorder them. The way to add new transforms is to click this plus button here, where you can view the available transform types and add them. So that's kind of a view of how transforms work. This tab is the code view. And what the code view does is give you insight into how OpenColorIO is working under the hood. The first tab is simply giving us our config YAML file with syntax highlighting so that you can browse through it and look at how things are actually being defined in the config file as you manipulate the parameters for the config or anything in the config. This will update live, but all of these code views that I'll show you, they will only update if you're viewing them. And now let's take a look at how working on a config interactively with an image viewer works, and how that will really improve config authoring workflows. So I'm going to go over to the image viewer here and load an image of a grasshopper that I've been using as I've been developing this application. So this viewport is using OcioView's GPU renderer, and it's backed by OpenImageIO so that it can pretty much load any image format that you would need. You can zoom in to look at the pixels if you want, or also zoom back out to fit the image in the window. As you can see, as I move the cursor around, we get pixel sampling below and the location of the pixel. The first row of samples is representative of your input. So this is the raw pixel data coming out of your image. And then the bottom row is the output. So this is with whatever transform we're looking at applied. So right now our output is just being passed through. So you can see the input and the output match. The plus icon here tells us that the transform we're viewing is being viewed in the forward direction. But we can toggle that to view the inverse direction and it will update here. So you have some indication of what it's doing. At the top of the viewer, we can select our input color space. This will be representative of how the image is encoded. So here we have an sRGB texture image, and then we can define the output. But if you notice, if I click on the output, it's just set to pass through. And that's because the application utilizes something called transform subscriptions, where we can define transforms on the config editor that we want viewers to subscribe to. There could be multiple viewers on multiple tabs that can toggle between the transforms very easily. And then as transforms are updated in the config editor, you will see near real-time feedback of those changes in the viewport. So let's look at how transform subscriptions work. So if we go over to color spaces, and we set our input here to sRGB texture, and then we have all these other color spaces. Well, what we can do
is the number keys without any sort of modifier like Control or Alt work both in the config item lists as well as in the viewer. And so by going over to our color space list here, we can select a color space, and I can just, for example, hit the 1 key, and you'll see that we get a little yellow 1, and we can just kind of go down to the list and assign numbers. We're creating subscriptions to these transforms so that as they are updated, they will report to any viewer that's subscribing and it will get an update. And then if we come over to the viewer and click on where it was just passed through before, you'll see that we have all 4 of these items available to look at. You can of course click on them in this menu, or you could just use, again, number keys without any modifiers right in the viewport. So I can toggle 1, 2, 3, 4, and we can flip between these. And again, this controls directionality of the transforms. So right now it's showing us the forward direction, and if we click this, it will invert it. And you'll see now that we have these transforms applied. If I scrub the pixels with the cursor, we'll see that the sample values below are now showing us the difference between our sRGB input and the linear V-gamut output. So let's select that color space. We'll go to its transforms, and I'll just show you how if we want to go here, let's just add an exponent, and I'm going to bump up the red channel to see that we get live feedback in the viewer of those changes. And there is an undo and redo stack in this application, so Control Z and I can, undo that work and delete it. And so any sort of changes you get here will find their way into the viewport. Let's go back and look at the code view. So if we jump over to the code view, you're going to see that we now have shader code in here for the processor we're now viewing. And as we toggle through the subscribed transforms, you'll notice that the shader is going to update and give us the shader code. Similarly, if we go over to the CTF and we toggle through it, it's going to go ahead and update the CTF as well.
Right, Carol, you can go to the next slide. So that's kind of a demo of the application in use. There's a fair amount more to it and a lot of additional potential that we could implement there. But the application, as it says here, is in an alpha state. So we're inviting testers and contributors. Rémi's already contributed to it and helped add support for Mac OS since I developed it on Windows. But one of the cool things about this project is it's a really great opportunity for like pipeline developers and UI UX designers to contribute, folks that may not have felt comfortable contributing to like OCIO's core and all the color science stuff. So it's a great opportunity to look at how we can improve workflows around authoring configs and even just learning about the project through experimenting with it. And there's a lot of, like I mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity to evolve. I've dreamt up a lot of additional features I'd like to add, things like being able to view like chromaticity diagrams and to plot LUTs in 3D space. And so it'll continue evolving, over the next year and in the future. But yeah, just invite you to participate if you're interested and to give it a try and give us your feedback. Thank you so much. I guess with that, I'll hand it over to Éric at Epic.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, this is awesome. Hey, everyone, I'm Éric. I'm part of the virtual production team at Epic Games. Also work on all things color with our principal color scientist, Rod Bogart. So I'll talk about how we integrated OCIO in the engine, and hopefully this can be useful to other library users. Next slide, please. So we use the OCIO in actually many places throughout the engine, the main ones being viewports, of course, both in editor through drop-down menus and in game mode enabled through our Blueprint visual scripting language. We also support virtual production workflows in the NDisplay plugin. So this is to get color accurate transforms from the engine to the LED walls, obviously critical. We also support offline rendering with our Movie Render Queue plugin, compositing with the Composure plugin, and more recently, we started to leverage OCIO code under the hood for advanced color settings on texture assets. I provided the link to our docs here. Please feel free to consult and get going. So I'll cover some of the timeline of how the integration was done in Unreal. This was first done before my time at Epic in the 4.22 release. This was around 2019. And over time, obviously, the features and the integration expanded, as I covered previously. In Unreal 5, we silently upgraded the library to V2 and added Mac and Linux support. And in 5.1, we actually toggled the switch there to use the new V2 features, mainly the GPU processor there. We also updated the library to 2.2 at that stage, and also fixed a precision. We were sort of betraying our users a little bit due to some internal constraint for using 16-bit float 3D LUTs, and so we fixed that then. Yeah, so obviously essential. And then we added display view support as well, and that's at that stage. So next slide, please. Right, so in Unreal 5.2, which was the most recent one, we did a fix to disallow 1D textures. So the engine supports 2D textures and buffers, and we realized that OcioView was sort of switching texture dimensions when the resource height was 1 pixel. And so we sort of worked on a PR there to disable that behavior or make it more explicit as well. So yeah, that's fixed. We also enabled built-in transform support quite easily just by essentially letting users provide URIs. So that was nice and convenient. And at that stage, we also simplified our rendering just using our render dependency graph API. And this meant that we could collapse the rendering into a single pass function that's now public for advanced users. And it also has a fallback behavior. So if something on the config changes and your color settings become invalid, we just display this invalid error message now, and it sort of helps with debugging issues if this occurs. In terms of features that are coming up very soon, we recently worked on a refactor of the library to move it closer to the engine, to the core engines, to enable features such as texture assets, conversions. And we're hoping to leverage, the library more and more there. We also exposed CPU transforms finally through editor blueprints. Right, and then we also added working color space integration. So the engine now has an explicit working color space definition, and when your config has the interchange space defined, we're able to link that and expose the engine working color space sort of as an option in your config menus. Almost lastly, we also did some caching improvements recently. This is simply because we were recomputing shaders and texture assets, texture resources too often. So this is now, if you sort of take your old configuration assets and resave them, you're going to have better load times. We also recently disabled delay loading. This was causing issues with data members on the library, such as string roles. We couldn't read those, but that's now been fixed by avoiding the delay load. And finally, looking ahead, we're certainly hoping to increase our reliance on the library whenever color transform is needed, color accuracy, and obviously with the move to the core engine, that's going to become hopefully more possible. And we also would like to improve some of the HSL generation. We noticed that we did get some warnings, so that's going to be an area of focus soon to try to prevent it's minor things like performance warnings with certain data types, but this could benefit other users as well. So yeah, looking forward to that. And thanks, finally, thanks to the community, of course, for reviewing our PRs. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's it for me.
Cool, thanks, Eric. And thanks to all of our presenters today and for everybody that was able to jump on and listen live. We do have just one more slide that I want to point out before we jump to Q&A. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so if you've got questions, you can feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat and we'll get to them. We have a couple events directly at SIGGRAPH that we want to call out separate from what, well, in addition to what Emily said. Our Birds of a Feather, just so you have it here, is on Monday, August 7th in person, and that'll be an informal discussion. It will not be the same presentation. We want to talk to users. We have some topics in mind, but if you have topics you want to talk about, please bring them to this discussion, and we'll make sure we try and get to as many as we can in the hour that we have. And then we're doing a little bit of a social event similar to what we did last year in Vancouver, bringing back just the ability for us involved in OCIO and other image related projects, color, or if you just want to come by and hang out with us, we're doing a social event at High Def Brewing, which is just about a 10-minute walk from the convention center in Los Angeles on Monday evening. And then I'll put this slide up here, just our get involved slide and all those things so you have it. And then if you have questions, we can take them now. Take a look at the chat.
And thank you especially to Michael and Eric for those great presentations from Epic. It's been amazing to get Epic's contributions, not only this year, but in past years as well. They've been tremendous supporters of the project, and I'm really looking forward to OcioView especially. It's going to be a huge new addition, I think, to the project.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So if there's any questions, I don't see any hand raises, but I'll leave it for a few minutes and see if we get any otherwise.
As Carol said, the TSC meetings are open, so feel free to, if you have a question, but you don't feel like asking it today, or if it occurs to you later, please feel free to drop by our TSC meetings, and we're always keen to hear more of what people are wrestling with or finding difficult to understand, or things they're trying to do in other applications. That's all great input for us on the TSC.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize there's the other specific Q&A enabled, Karen. Sorry, it's not even showing up on my screen. So thank you for putting that question there. The question was for the for posterity, for those looking to get involved in OCIO, what's a great way for someone new to be involved? And I think that like what Doug was saying, I think the first step is to start coming to our meetings, start playing around with OCIO. I think that the tough part about a lot of the projects in the foundation, and this is something that you've probably heard myself or Larry Gritz say before, is that they're very purpose built and purpose driven, and sometimes you don't really even see that you're using them because your application is using OCIO by default, but you don't know necessarily that that's what's happening. We find that a great way into the project is to have used it and know and have experience using it as a user, know what it's about, figure that stuff out first. So my advice would be, once we release OcioView, for you to be able to pull that application down and play with it visually, like Michael was saying, is a great introduction into OCIO. The config library also, it's a separate GitHub repo from our main GitHub repo, and it's all Python based. So, and that is generating configs, from generating configs from a lot of different things into a YAML file with configuration options and things like we need help there with like unit tests and all those types of things, and documentation for the config repo. And that's a little bit of a lighter intro into OCIO than just diving into the core C++ libraries that are a little bit intimidating. Also things like Doug said, there's, we have our app helpers, which don't really touch as much into the core library and then can be added onto and things. So we'll be looking for some support there. But really, I think in order to, contribute into OCIO, you do have to sort of know what it is and what its functions are. And so we're happy to help get you there and point you at some resources and how to dive into OCIO and learn how to use it and learn what it's for. And then hopefully you'll be able to contribute from there.
Yeah, and for people who are C++ developers, we do have on GitHub, we have a tag in the issues list for good first issues and help wanted. And we're planning on actually doing some work to expand the list. So around September, October timeframe, we're planning on beefing up that list of good first issues. I know I think there's about half a dozen there right now. If people want to find like an easy thing to tackle, but please feel free to reach out on Slack as well if you'd like to get involved and are looking for a way to contribute.
Great. If there are no other questions, we're pretty much at time, and the Material X virtual town hall is directly after this one. So I don't want to hold people. If you're also interested in that project, I want to give you the opportunity to hop over that. Other than that, thanks for joining. Have a great day, and we'll hopefully see a subset of you at SIGGRAPH.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.